I am live. I'm reading out of Return to Elysium. It is another of Joan Grant's far memory books. This is her life as Lucina. It is playing in Greece. She lived her early years on a very remote island, just with 2 or 3 people. And in this last chapter, she found out who her mother was. We are now in chapter 6, and it's entitled Sea Urchin. A fly, this place, 2nd century BC. A fly settled on the nose of the nymph opposite me. Instead of brushing it off, she continued to stare at the pomegranate in her hand with her foolish smile unchanged. It was easy enough for her. She was marble, blocks of stone, a half-finished frieze, a broken torso, all of them kept their interminable pose without effort, but Praxiteles seemed to have forgotten that his model was alive. He turned to select a broader spatula, and I gave a quick rub to my right thigh, which was protesting against this laborious inactivity. "Tired, Lucina?" He sounded resigned, the parent trying to be patient with a difficult child. "Why should I be? I've only been standing here for 3 hours. He ignored my sarcasm, glanced at the high window and said cheerfully, "Good, I thought it was much later. I shall be able to finish your left buttock before we leave off. I will tell my buttock that it may feel duly honored." "Buttock, cease complaining. You're being immortalized. Consider how smug you will feel when you are safe in the best quality Pentelic marble, while the rest of me is only a handful of ashes. Don't talk unless it helps you to keep still. Don't answer, buttock. He is not interested in our opinions, only in the shape to which we have contorted ourselves for his convenience." Pellets of clay continued to fall on the floor. Praxiteles began to whistle through his teeth, usually a sign that he was impatient. If he got sufficiently impatient, he would pause only long enough to cover the clay with a wet cloth, and then rush out of the studio. He stopped whistling. There was no immediate escape which I could accept without loss of pride. At least I could move my eyes without displaying weakness. They showed me 5 Lucinas, though 3 of these were only in clay. Lucina the child, who had come to Elysium 3 years ago, looking pensively into a rock pool. This had been intended for a fountain, but was never finished. Lucina, aged 14, carrying a wine jug on her shoulder. Lucina asleep, her hands folded, her feet resting against a young ram. This had been one of the early models for the sarcophagus of the daughter of an Athenian merchant, an acquaintance of Epicurus. There was also Lucina throwing a discus, and Lucina as Artemis with a young hind. No one found it odd that I could stand here and see 5 people who were separate entities and yet an integral part of myself. But if I claimed to have been people who belonged to other centuries instead of only to other years, I was considered a fool. Perhaps I was a fool, otherwise I should not have held this pose so long, much longer than Euripides or any of the others would have done. "Enough for today," Praxiteles sounded pleased with himself. "At least I should be spared further effort for the sake of my right buttock, or was it the left one? I was too tired to bother. Are you coming to watch me wrestle with Agamemnon? We want to practice a new throw. It might be interesting." Watching them wrestle always made me afraid, which of course I could not admit, so I quickly thought of an excuse. "I promised Epicurus to get some sea urchins. He wants to find out if they go well with the new sauce he invented for crab last week." "Oh, it was a good sauce," said Praxiteles with kindly patronage. "A considerable improvement on garlic and mussels. Even if the mussels had been free of sand, it would still have been an error of taste." Criticism of Epicurus always annoyed me. Luckily, some of us have grown beyond the primitive desire for mutton in prodigious quantity. To quote Arisclapius, "A subtle palate is an indication of the mature intellect." He grinned. Preoccupation with a belly is apt to make it bulge. Not that your figure shows any such tendency as yet, my dear Lucina. Why had I said I was going to collect urchins? Now I should have to do it, or else let Praxiteles think he had scored. But the alternative would be throwing the discus with Cleon and Euripides, or else running against them. I should have enjoyed the 2 hours we had to spend each day on some kind of athletics if only I had not had to exert myself to the utmost to maintain a measure of equality. At least I no longer had the humiliation of being given a start in each race. But it had not been easy to train in secret, so that no one should know how terribly hard I had to try at everything. I fetched a basket from the kitchen and was on my way down to the beach when I met Narcissus and Asclepius. Narcissus was carrying a cushion and obviously intended to spend a lazy afternoon. "I'm going to get urchins," I said briskly. The least you can do is to hold the basket." Narcissus smiled. "Nothing would please me more, Lucina, especially as you are far too fragile to be trusted on the beach alone." The presence of Asclepius made it impossible to retort adequately, so I pretended not to notice the insult. About 3 hours later, Narcissus stood just out of reach of the ripples, still holding the basket. "Surely you've got enough now," he said plaintively. "There were 23 when I last counted. I want at least 12 more. It's your fault we've taken so long. If you had helped, instead of grumbling, we would have been home by now." After making sure it was dry, he sat on a rock, staring disconsolately at a long green smear on the front of his tunic. He had fallen down while I was urging him to hurry across a rack of slimy weed. I found another urchin lurking in the sand at the water's edge. I was feeling impatient with Narcissus, so instead of taking it to the basket, I threw it to him. Instinctively he caught it and then yelped with pain. I ought to have remembered he had taken off his gloves, thick leather ones we always used when handling urchins. I knew how painful the spines could be, for I had got one in my foot a month earlier and could not run properly for several days. Perhaps it would have been easier to show sympathy if I had not an uncomfortable feeling that I had known his hands were bare, and thought it would be funny to punish him for being too lazy to help me. "Does it hurt much?" I said, fighting a sudden urge to giggle. "Pull out the spines and then you can suck it to stop the bleeding." "The taste of blood revolts me, and I might swallow a spine and choke." I took one of the silver pins which I used to keep my hair out of the way when I was too busy to do it properly. It shan't hurt if you keep still." There were 3 spines. 2 came out easily, but I had to dig deep to get out the last without breaking it. A little blood oozed out of the hole and trickled down his arm. "I lick it if you mind the taste," I said kindly. To my shame, he seemed genuinely grateful. "Thank you, Lucina. I must apologize for thinking you threw it on purpose. Of course I know you mistook it for a pebble. It's extraordinary how pain can make one temporarily lose all sense of justice." He sounded sincere, but could he really be so guileless? Did we all underrate him? Perhaps we did. I looked at him with new respect. The basket had fallen over. I picked up an urchin, forgetting that I had taken off my gloves. "Poor Lucina, how very distressing. You got far more spines than I did. Can I help?" I could have cried with pain and humiliation, but I said, "No, thank you, I can manage quite well." Several of the spines had broken off. I knew that if I did not get them out, they would probably fester. I had to use the pin with my left hand, which made the operation more complicated. Narcissus watched me, his lips grave, his eyes alert as a child who sees a new toy being unwrapped. "Does it hurt much?" I sucked my palm, which tasted of wet leather and fish scales. "It doesn't hurt at all," I said firmly. "I like blood. It's a more dramatic scarlet than anemones." I saw this disturbed him a little, so I held my hand over a rock pool and watched the slow drops spread through the water, fanning out until they looked like a new kind of seaweed. "You are rather like a sea urchin yourself, Lucina," he said reflectively. "Soft-hearted and delicious, but without menace if handled carelessly." I thought it wise to take this as a joke, and no trouble to anyone so long as he doesn't tread on me. But who does? Certainly not I. Is Cleon perhaps a little apt to be obtuse? Cleon? What has Cleon got to do with it? A trivial remark quite unworthy of serious consideration. It only seemed that there were occasions when he overemphasized that we had all been told to ignore the obvious fact that you might be our complement instead of our rival. You mean that instead of throwing a discus, I should be content to sit making a wreath with which humbly to reward the victor? And I suppose I ought to keep silent in discussions, eager to enrich my inferior mind with such morsels of wisdom as may be thrown to me. Nothing so crude, Lucina. It's only that I find it distressing to see you consistently trying to exchange your natural talents for those of the less complex male. For instance, you had to tell me in the presence of Asclepius that I was to carry this basket for you. I obeyed. You must admit, with no trace of resentment. Had you been a less exacting personality, I should have asked, even perhaps implored, you to let me do this trivial service. I should have admired the charming composition made by your yellow hair against the varied blues and greens which the sea so thoughtfully provides for a background. I should have helped you to collect this unnecessary trophy, instead of taking pleasure in the fact that you are getting tired, but too proud to admit it. You're wet and dirty, but too lazy to notice it. You have been doing a man's work, but are too stupid to be ashamed of it. I was more surprised than if a strand of seaweed had suddenly coiled to hiss at me. Then I realized it was worse than this. He wasn't being unkind. He was sorry for me. So you think I'm a fool? You may be right. I had never really thought about it before. He deliberately tore a strip off the hem of his tunic, took my hand out of the water and bandaged it. Narcissus, not caring if his tunic, and it was a new one, was spoiled, not trying to escape from the sight of blood, and there was quite a lot of blood. Hadn't you better learn to let people do things for you? He said gently. You're frightening nearly as hard as Agamemnon, and you don't need to fight us unless you insist. What else can I do? I'm younger than any of you, and not so clever about the knowledge which comes from books. Asclepius has told me not to believe the things which none of you understand. He says I have got to be strong, that I must never let myself be dependent on other people. I have to run faster, think quicker, be more sure of myself than any of you. And all the time I know you are just being kind. Well, even if we are, is kindness an insult? It is when one doesn't deserve it. Has it never occurred to you, dear and rather silly Lucina, that we like you for all the things you despise in yourself? If I want to admire an athlete, I can turn to Praxiteles. If I want to be impressed by learning, there's always Asclepius. If I want to be burnished by someone else's superior wit, I can seek the company of Euripides. I know that perfectly well, I said bitterly. That's why I have to try harder and harder at everything, all the time. Why not accept yourself as you are? And be sent away because I have shown that a woman can never be a competent philosopher? She might be, if she was first a competent woman, or even a competent girl. Why should I want to be a woman? All of you despise females. In Elysium, they are not even good enough to wash clothes. Look what happened to my mother. She died because she gave up being a priest and wanted to be loved as an ordinary, safe, silly woman. She died, and I am not nearly ready to die yet. So why not try living for a change? I'm not a coward, I said passionately. I don't try to escape from being hurt. My hand hurts more than yours, but I didn't make nearly so much fuss. I only pretended it hurt me because I wanted to make you feel guilty. Maybe the other person feel ashamed and you are halfway to victory. Make the other person feel ashamed and You are halfway to victory. If there were more of the true female in you, Lucina, you would have learned so obvious a strategy. I thought strategy was only used by soldiers. Did you? How curious, for you are not lacking in subtlety, though at times you were a little crude in your methods. The urchin, for instance. Surely you don't think I really believed you mistook it for a petal? I wasn't sure, I said frankly. At first I thought you couldn't be such a fool, and then, well, now I know you couldn't. He laughed. The first real compliment you have ever paid me. And it won't be the last, and if you don't hate me for being so disgusting and so blind. I'm the only person here who has not been asked to share in your education. But if you feel inclined to accept my devoted service, I think I might prove not entirely useless. I should be very grateful if you could teach me, Narcissus, what you want me to learn. You needn't sound so depressed. The lessons will not be without interest, and I want to show you how to use the natural weapons with which you have been most generously endowed. And I finished this here now because of my battery.